Let's bow our heads. Father, as we worship together, I ask that you be with us here today. And as we close out the songs, and as I am up here speaking, let it not be about us. Let it be about you. Let it not be about anything that we've done up here or will do up here. Let it all be pointing to you. Be with me, be with the words that I say, and let them not be my words. Let them be your words, not my thoughts, but your thoughts. And we just invite you to be here with us, worshiping together. Thank you. Amen. The sign said, "Do not enter." Or at least that's what the sign would have said had it been posted. Or if it was posted, had we actually seen it. It was late one night while I was in college, and a group of friends and I were out at a movie. No idea, don't remember what the movie was. But as we came out, as we went to the car, as we left, we made a turn onto the road and realized very quickly something wasn't right. I don't know if the roads in downtown Lincoln are a lot like the roads here in Boise. I think they are, because some engineering mind, you can say that they're a good engineering mind or potentially not a good engineering mind, decided that it would be a great idea to make the downtown area a network of one-way streets. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. And supposedly it's to help move more cars through. And when it works great. But when you get confused or turned around, as we did that night, you can find yourself staring head on into a bank of headlights, all coming your direction in all the lanes. And had we taken a few more seconds to think, or had there been a "do not enter" sign present, we might not have made that incorrect turn. Life is a lot like a "do not enter" sign. Oftentimes we are moving along, moving through life, and we don't want to make mistakes. And so we put up "do not enter" signs. And perhaps we might, as Christians, put up "do not enter" signs where they were never meant to be, and call it Christianity, or call it faith, or call it our religion. And as we opened up last week, and as we're continuing this week, we're looking into the life of Joseph. Last week we focused on the time that Joseph spent in the bottom of the well. The Bible doesn't give much detail on that particular time in Joseph's life, but at the very least we know from looking before and looking afterwards that the time that was spent in the well was a wake-up call to Joseph. And we paralleled this with our own lives, and oftentimes we're moving along, we are caught in a habit, we've kind of put ourselves on autopilot, and we're just walking along making a rut, or making the rut deeper, until there's walls up on both sides of us. But as soon as we realize that we're in a rut, and as soon as we realize that we probably don't want to be in the rut, we talked about what's the first step in figuring out how to get out of the rut. And we talked about that you have to pick one side or the other side of the rut to climb out on, because if you try to blend both sides, you end up right back in the middle in your rut. And we left off last week with Joseph thinking that he had reached the bottom, at the bottom of the well, realizing that there was a further bottom, and that was being sold into slavery. And we left him as he was headed down to Egypt. Life for Joseph in Egypt didn't really take a turn for the better. because he was sold to a man named Potiphar, the captain of the guard, who was a very important man, very influential, but probably didn't take very good care of his slaves. But there was something different about Joseph. And so as time went on, years passed, Joseph was able to gain the favor of Potiphar, and Potiphar actually took a liking to Joseph and realized that, hey, everything I give this guy to do, it seems to work out really well, and so let me just keep on giving more and more responsibility until eventually Joseph was the head servant over all of the other servants, really over the entire household, save Potiphar and his wife. And that was going fairly decently until a false accusation that landed Joseph even further down in jail for a crime he didn't commit, and finding out that there's even a new level of low, a new bottom that's lower than the bottom of a well. It's lower than being a slave. It's even lower. Being a slave in jail doesn't really give you a whole lot of hope. And time in jail went on, time passed, and Joseph did the similar thing that he did with Potiphar. He just did what he always did and just helped out where he could, focused in on what he could do in the moment. And over time, the jailer, the warden of the prison, noticed, hey, everything that this guy says that he's going to do, he does. And everything that he does seems to work out better than any of the other people. And so slowly Joseph ends up becoming what we could call assistant warden, or basically the go-to person that the warden had in case he needed any help with something. And as time went on in the jail, things kind of opened up a little bit until there was this meeting, until a couple of unlikely people ended up in the jail with Joseph. There was the king's cupbearer and the king's baker. And while the Bible doesn't specifically say this, the fact that the baker and the cupbearer were in jail makes me think that something had happened to Pharaoh's food. Maybe something had gotten in it and the Pharaoh got really sick. And the baker, the person who made the food, or the cupbearer, and the cupbearer was an interesting role because the cupbearer was kind of the last stop before food reached the king, before food reached Pharaoh. And the cupbearer's responsibility was to essentially taste test the food, and if the food settled in the cupbearer's stomach, or if the cupbearer didn't fall over and die, then the king knew it was safe to eat. But something happened. Perhaps the cupbearer didn't eat the right part of that muffin or something, but the king ate, he got really sick, but the cupbearer didn't, and the baker was the one who made it, and so Pharaoh locks these two men up in his prison. And Pharaoh's prison was the prison, you could call it like the maximum security prison. The people who Pharaoh really wanted to keep a close eye on, make sure that they didn't get away, those were the people who were in this prison. And time went on, and Joseph went around, was serving, was helping out, and until one day, and both the baker and the cupbearer had dreams that confused them and disturbed them. And as Joseph came around, he saw that they weren't the same as they had always been, and so he asked them, hey, what's going on, guys? And he said, well, we both had dreams, and we were a little confused by these dreams. And Joseph remembers that he had had a dream. He had had two dreams that were also confusing. He kind of had an idea of what they might mean, but he didn't have an idea of what would happen or that path. So he said, hey, tell me what the dreams are. There's a God up in heaven. I know him. I'm sure he can help us figure out what these dreams mean. And so Joseph interprets the cupbearer's dream. He said, oh, well, that's a great dream. That means in 3 days you're going to go back to Pharaoh. The baker's like, oh, that's good for him. Here's my dream. And Joseph's like, hate to break it to you, it's not such a good dream after all, because that means that in 3 days, it's going to be the end of you. And these dreams and these predictions that God had given these two men came to pass. In 3 days, the cupbearer went back to Pharaoh. And in 3 days, the baker was executed. And as the cupbearer was going back up to Pharaoh, as he was leaving the jail, Joseph meets him, like probably the last morning. He says, hey, when you get back up to Pharaoh, bring my case to him. I'm here wrongfully. I was sold into slave wrongfully. I was accused for something I never did. Just bring my case to Pharaoh, and perhaps he can take a look and research into the matter and find out that I'm really innocent. I shouldn't be here. And then we come to the point in the story that we want to focus on today. Another point in Joseph's story that the Bible doesn't talk about. It only gives us one verse, the very last verse of Genesis chapter 40. And it simply says, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. The cupbearer forgot about Joseph. Joseph's down there in prison. He has this shred of hope that he's going to be released. But then he's waiting. He's waiting. But Joseph wasn't waiting for the cupbearer. Joseph was not waiting for the cupbearer nearly as much as he was waiting on God. Because as we look back into Joseph's life, he had these dreams. He had probably kind of pushed them to the back of his mind up until the cupbearer and the baker share their dreams. But he had these dreams, and he didn't know what to make of them then. He sure didn't know what to make of them now. And perhaps he thought, well, that could have been a future that I might have had, but things aren't going the way that makes sense. And something must have happened that deviated that path. And oftentimes in our own lives, if we've grown up, if we've had these dreams, we've had these ideals, this great plan for our life, and then it meets reality, things usually don't go nearly as smoothly. And as Joseph is waiting in the jail cell, as Joseph is waiting in prison, he's waiting on God, thinking perhaps that God had put the do not enter sign in front of his path. Oftentimes in our lives, we also look at God's direction, God's leading in our own lives. And we think that when God closes a door, when we think that it's him putting up a do not enter sign, or perhaps we have a different thought. Perhaps when we're getting ready to step out, as we began talking about last week, and as we decide which side of the rut that we want to climb out on, then we face a do not enter sign. Or at least it's a do not enter sign that we've made in our minds. Because what's worse than not doing anything, or what's worse than staying in that rut, is going in the wrong direction. Especially if you're wanting to go in the direction that God wants you to go. It's really bad to go in the wrong direction. And so we put up a do not enter sign. And we tell ourselves a lie. We tell ourselves a lie that says something to the effect of, when God opens a door, I will walk through it. I will stay here. I'm going to climb out of the rut on this side, but I want to be able to climb out it in the direction that God wants me to go. And so I'm firmly planted on this side, but I'm going to wait for God to open that door. And we still stand here, waiting, waiting. But there's a big difference between our waiting and Joseph's waiting. We're both waiting on God, but there's a big difference between our waiting and Joseph's waiting. When we wait, we see it as a do not enter sign. But when Joseph was waiting, he saw it differently. He saw it as waiting like if you're at a fancy restaurant. Waiting is in helping people, helping the other people be refreshed, helping everyone who he meets be a little bit better. He was waiting. He was waiting. He was serving. And he wasn't focused on the closed doors. We have a verse that we like to put up, we like to focus on when it talks about waiting and waiting on God. We sang about it this morning. We sang about it in that last song, The Power of Your Love. The verse, it's in Isaiah chapter 40, and it's verse 31. It says, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." That's an amazing promise, those who wait on the Lord. But the question is the waiting like a do not enter sign? Or is the waiting like a pitcher of water? Is the waiting talking about inaction? Or is the waiting talking about serving? And that's the question that always runs through my mind when I think about this idea. A lot of the newer translations of the Bible, they use hope for, long for, put your faith in, trust in, words like that. And while I completely agree that the idea of waiting is there, is those thoughts and those ideas are wrapped up in this idea of waiting, I think also that using those words rather than the idea of wait leaves something out. Leaves something out, as the idea of waiting can also involve serving. But perhaps this is something that's just in my mind. Perhaps it really is waiting. Perhaps it really is inaction. If we wait for God, he will refresh us, he will renew us, he will strengthen us, and we should just wait. So I thought to myself, what's the easiest, or what's the, really not necessarily the easiest, but what's the best way of unpacking what this idea of waiting on God is? Well, in reality, it's looking at other Bible passages that use this same word for wait, use the same idea. And so I did a little bit of a fun concordance study on the word wait. And I came across something really fascinating. I came across verses like this. Job chapter 7, verse 1, verse 2, we'll get to it. "Is not man forced to labor on earth, and are not his days like the days of a hired man? As a slave who pants for the shade, as a hired man who eagerly waits for his wages." Well, this has got to be it. This has got to be like you and I waiting anxiously for that paycheck, for payday, because we're so excited when that every 2 weeks or every week or every month or however often you get paid, when that day comes, it's a happy day and we wait for that day. But look with me a little bit deeper. If you didn't wait and serve, you're not going to get much of a paycheck when it comes. And if you really don't wait well, if you really don't serve your employer well, it's unlikely that you're going to be getting a paycheck for very much longer either. And so wrapped up in this idea of longing and hoping for, there's the idea of service. There's the idea of trust. You trust your employer that they're going to have the money to make bankroll. They're going to have that money to pay you. But your employer's trusting you that you're going to do the job that he's paying you for, and you're going to do a good job. There's this trust that's also included in this idea of waiting. Continuing or jumping into the book of Psalms, to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. Oh my God, I trust in you. Let me not be ashamed. Let not my enemies triumph over me. Indeed, let no one who waits on you be ashamed. Let no one who waits on you. Let no one who looks at you in like just being inactive and looks at you, let those people not be ashamed? Or let no one who serves you, let no one who follows after you, let no one who puts their hope in, their faith and their trust in you, let not any of those people be ashamed. I think there's a deeper meaning here. But the psalmist continues, let those be ashamed who deal treacherously without cause. There is shame that comes, but the shame that comes is intended for those people who are doing cruel things with no reason whatsoever, maybe calling it fun, but there's no valid reason. That's an appropriate shame. Show me your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me. For you are the God of my salvation. On you I wait all the day. On you I put my faith in. I put my hope in. Put my trust in. On you I serve. Not on you I stand idly by and watch. There's deeper meaning here. I continued on just a couple Psalms later. Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. I don't know about you, but at least in my own experience, courage, at least true courage, doesn't come through inaction. Sure, I could stand back in a corner completely separated from a challenge and say, oh, of course I could do that. That'd be easy. I could do that with my eyes closed and one hand tied behind my back. But as soon as you take a step forward, false courage disappears. And so you could say that courage comes, but if courage is going to come from God, it's got to come in a way that stays when you're moving forward, when you're taking that step. Wait on the Lord. There's that trust, there's that faith, there's that hope, but there's also that service. Jumping into Proverbs, I found this verse. Do not say, I will get even with you. Wait for the Lord and he will save you. Oh, this has got to be just don't even do that. It's saying, hey, do not say. That's got to be just hold off, stop. Don't do anything. God will take care of it. Is that really what it's saying here? Because that looks like a do not enter sign. It looks like God saying, hey, don't get even. Don't focus on getting even. But the best way to not focus on that do not enter sign is to be over here. Be over here focusing on serving, focusing on having faith, focusing on that trust. Wait. And this literally says, wait on the Lord and he will save you. This is focus on serving. Focus on serving God and having hope and faith and trust in him, looking to him and ignoring that do not enter sign, ignoring that thing that they had irritated you about, ignoring that way that they hurt you. That God will deal with them in his own time. God will right that wrong. But it's not up to us to get even. And we should be focusing on the waiting, on that having faith, that hope, that trust, that service to God. Jumping now several books later into Hosea, I found this verse. So you, by the help of your God, return. Observe mercy and justice and wait on your God continually. Is that observing mercy and justice and waiting on the sidelines? Or is that observing mercy and getting your hands dirty, moving forward justice, living justly, and serving God continually? Having faith, hope, trust, all of that stuff in there. but also having that service. I found 49 uses of that word wait. And somewhere between 14 and 19 could easily have the idea of service wrapped up in them. This is just a small group. And really there's more than 19 that, depending upon how you look at the idea of wait, it could involve not only that faith, hope, trust, longing for God, but it could also include service. It's not just taking one verse out of context. It's looking at a number of different verses and trying to get that full, deeper meaning. Get that full, deeper meaning. Looking at waiting, is it waiting with a do not enter? Like we oftentimes focus on? Waiting, saying, hey, soon as God opens that door, soon as he moves one of the do not enter signs, I'll be sure I'll go that direction. Or is it waiting like a server? Waiting like someone who is longing for helping others, whose focus is on helping people who are around them, making them better. But then what about Jesus? What about the New Testament? All this stuff that we've looked about is in the Old Testament. Is there any example that we can see in Jesus' life that makes us think of the do not enter sign? Or whether Jesus' idea of waiting is more on the serving side? There is one passage that stands above the rest. There's a number of times throughout Jesus' ministry that he helps people, he heals people, he teaches people. All through his ministry, Jesus is focusing on helping people to be better. There's one passage, there's one event that stands above the rest. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to take a little bit of time and dig into this passage. It's found in the book of John. John chapter 13. And to set the stage for this is in Jesus' last week before his crucifixion. John chapter 13. And Jesus had come into Jerusalem riding on the donkey. He had come into the temple. He had chased out all the money changers. He had given people a reminder and a glimpse of what God had intended for the temple to be. And that's a place that people of all nations, all backgrounds could come and learn more about God. He had given people a reminder of that. He had pulled the disciples together for a Passover. For the last Passover, he was alive, and he brought them to an upper room, and this is where we begin our passage, John chapter 13, verse 1. Before the Passover festival, Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go back to the Father. Jesus loved his own who were in the world, and he loved them to the end. And this loving those who are his that are in the world isn't just the disciples. That's everybody who is his, who's in the world, and that includes you and I. That includes you and I. And as we see through the entire crucifixion event, as Jesus moved towards the cross, was his love for everyone who is his. And that if we were watching a movie, the camera would shift. While supper was taking place, the devil had already put the idea of betraying Jesus into the mind of Judas, son of Iscariot. The camera would shift and it would focus on Judas with maybe a little bit of a mischievous, or deep in thought, facial expression. And the music background would kind of turn a little ominous. Judas is there scheming. He had already put the idea of betraying Jesus in the mind of Judas. Judas was already thinking about, all right, I've been paid. I need to figure the way out. How can I betray Jesus? But John doesn't leave his focus there because he immediately turns back to Jesus. The Father had put everything in Jesus' control. Jesus knew that. He also knew that he had come from God and was going back to God. This verse is really fascinating. The Father had put everything in Jesus' control. Jesus is the Son of God. He came, he performed miracles, he healed people. Isn't that evidence of the Father putting things in his control, or is this talking about something else? Why would John say something that was obvious? And as I wrestled with this phrase, with this sentence, I had the realization that as Jesus was growing up, as Jesus was working through his ministry, as Jesus was walking towards the cross, every little thing that Jesus did, and the Father saw him do, the Father was giving him more control, more responsibility, more leeway, more autonomy. This is like growing up, growing into the person that God would have Jesus be, but also the person, in our case, that God would have each one of us to be. And the Father had put everything in Jesus' control. That's a fascinating idea. And especially the idea that Jesus knew that means that everything that happened after this point was completely within Jesus' control. The entire cross was Jesus' decision. It wasn't God the Father pulling the shoestrings on the puppet Jesus. This was Jesus' choice. And while Jesus was praying in the garden, just a number of verses later, it wasn't that he not go to the cross, but he was asking, is there any other way to be able to do this? To be able to bring about salvation? But Jesus was firmly focused on that love for his own, that love for you and I, that love for his disciples, and for restoring that relationship. Continuing on. So what's the first thing that Jesus does when he's realized that everything has been put in his control? So he got up from the table and removed his outer clothes. And he took a towel. He wrapped it around his waist. Then he took some water, and he poured the water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. And dry them with the towel that he had around his waist. This is Jesus' level of service. This is not the do not enter sign service. This is not even the waiting and refreshing level of service. This is a completely different picture of service. This is a picture of God. A picture of God's character that it says that he's one who steps down. He stepped down from heaven to earth. He became human. He took the form of just a common worker, somebody who really wasn't all that spectacular. And he even steps down to the lowest role of servant before stepping into the most degrading form of death imaginable. Jesus is showing us God's level of service, a God who steps down, not who tries to build up or build himself up. He's much more interested in you and I. This picture of God is very inviting. It's a God that I can serve. It's a God that is more interested in me than in himself. And that's amazing. That's unlike any other God ever. And God wants us to be like him. God wants us to focus in on him. not on focusing in on a do not enter sign when we get ready to step out, but focusing in on serving, focusing in on serving others and helping others. And we look back at the life of Joseph. Joseph's type of waiting wasn't waiting with inaction. It wasn't waiting even really with service, even though that was a part of it. It was waiting, putting other people ahead of himself. Because that type of waiting is attractive. And that type of waiting is what brings about God's power in our lives. Because we know Joseph's story. We know what happens next. Joseph, as he was waiting in the prison for that 2-year block of time between the cupbearer leaving and him getting a little bit of hope, and the cupbearer finally remembering, is maybe where some of us are in our own lives, where things are down. We're about as low as we think we can go after having been as low as we thought we could go numerous times before. But right around the corner is what God wants to bring you to in your life. And next week, as we wrap up this Stepping Out series, and as we look at the rest of Joseph's life, we can see that in every single step of the way, as Joseph steps towards God, steps towards service, steps toward waiting in a godly fashion with that faith and hope and trust and service, that God was able to use him, both in every step of the way, but in a way that Joseph couldn't have even possibly imagined. And what I learned from this, and what we can take from this today, is waiting on God is not only service, but it's also focusing in on what God did for us. Putting and turning our eyes, our hearts, and our focus on Jesus.